The Philippines before Spain, the lost civilization that thrived for thousands of years. The Philippines did not begin with Spain. That sounds like an obvious statement. Of course, a place doesn't begin the moment a foreign ship appears on its horizon. But the way Philippine history has been taught, in textbooks, in classrooms, in the cultural memory of people who learn their history through a colonial lens, has operated for centuries as though it did. As though the 7,000 islands of the Philippine archipelago were essentially empty of meaningful history until Ferdinand Magellan arrived in 1521 and gave the place a story worth telling. That version of events is not just incomplete. It is a lie of a mission, so enormous, so consequential, that correcting it requires going back not decades or centuries, but hundreds of thousands of years, to a time when a species of human being that science didn't even know existed was already living in the caves of Luzon, making tools, navigating island crossings, surviving in a landscape that would eventually become one of the most biologically and culturally rich places on Earth. The Philippines was not discovered by Europe. It was a civilization, layered, complex, internationally connected, literate, and thriving, that Europe stumbled into and then spent 3.5 centuries trying to convince the world had never existed before they got there. This is the story of what was actually there. Begin with the oldest evidence, because it establishes something fundamental about the depth of human presence in this archipelago that most people never encounter. In 2018, archaeologists working at a site in Kalinga province in northern Luzon uncovered the butchered bones of an ancient rhinoceros species that no longer exists, and the cuts on those bones, made by stone tools held in human hands, were dated to approximately 709,000 years ago. Not 709 years, not 7,000 years, 709,000 years, at a moment when the anatomically modern human beings who would eventually populate the planet had not yet fully evolved in Africa. Something, some kind of hominin, some relative of our species, navigating the early chapters of the human story, was already in the Philippines, processing animal carcasses with stone tools, living its life in what would one day be called Luzon. The identity of that tool user remains uncertain. What is certain is that the Philippine archipelago has been part of the human story for an almost incomprehensibly long time. Then, in 2019, a team of paleoanthropologists working in Calao Cave in northern Luzon announced one of the most significant discoveries in the history of paleoanthropology, a previously unknown species of ancient human. They called it Homo Luzonensis. Identified from a small collection of teeth and bones, 7 teeth and 6 small bones in total, recovered from excavations that began in 2007. Homo Luzonensis presented a combination of physical features that no one had ever seen before in any known hominin species. Some features looked ancient, reminiscent of our earlier evolutionary relatives. Others were more modern. Together, they formed a profile that fit nothing in the existing human family tree and had to be given a new branch entirely. A subsequent study in 2023 pushed the dating of these remains back to at least 134,000 years ago. Homo Luzonensis was not a temporary visitor, passing through on the way somewhere else. It was a species, distinct and separate, that lived in the Philippine archipelago for an extended period, adapted to its specific environment, and represents a chapter of human evolutionary history that existed nowhere else on Earth. The Philippines was not a place where human history arrived from outside. It was a place where human history was independently made. Modern Homo sapiens arrived in the Philippines at least 47,000 years ago, and we know this because of another cave, the Taban Caves on the island of Palawan, where the fossil remains of anatomically modern humans were discovered by archaeologist Robert Fox in 1962. These remains, including fragments of a skull and jaw bones belonging to multiple individuals, have been dated to approximately 47,000 years before the present, making them among the earliest confirmed modern human fossils found anywhere in Southeast Asia. The Taban Caves themselves became one of the most important archaeological sites in the Philippines, yielding not just human fossils, but over 1,500 burial jars, stone tools, jade ornaments, and evidence of continuous human occupation, stretching from the deep Pleistocene to the early historical period. A record spanning tens of thousands of years of human life in a single location. The cave was dubbed the cradle of Philippine civilization. And while that phrase can feel like tourist brochure language, the archaeological reality behind it is genuinely extraordinary. Among the objects recovered from the Taban Caves, one stands above all others in its cultural and artistic significance. The Manunggul Jar is a burial jar dated to approximately 890 to 710 BCE, roughly the same period as the height of ancient Greece's Archaic period, the same era that produced the earliest roots of the philosophical traditions the Western world would later claim as the foundation of civilization. This jar, shaped from clay and fired, features a lid sculpted into an image of two human figures in a small boat, one figure paddling, the other sitting upright, with arms crossed over the chest in a posture of finality, of rest, of death. The boat is navigating, the figures suggest, to wherever the dead go after this life. The artistry is not crude. The anatomical proportions of the figures are carefully rendered. The composition, two beings, a vessel, a journey, communicates a complete and coherent cosmological idea about the nature of death and what lies beyond it. This is not the work of a primitive people. This is the material expression of a sophisticated spiritual worldview, given form by a craftsperson who understood their medium and their message, created nearly 3,000 years ago. The Manunggul Jar also tells us something specific and important about the people who made it, beyond the spiritual worldview embedded in its imagery. The boat on the lid of the jar is not a metaphor for a generic vessel. It is recognizably an outrigger boat, the same basic technology that would define Philippine maritime culture for thousands of years, that would carry traders from the Philippine Islands to China and Japan and Java and Borneo and eventually across the Pacific, that would shape the entire civilizational trajectory of the Austronesian-speaking peoples of maritime Southeast Asia. The people who buried their dead in jars shaped like that boat, who placed a figure on the lid, paddling toward the afterlife, were already, 3,000 years ago, a people who understood themselves in terms of the sea and the boat. Their identity was maritime at its deepest roots. Those maritime roots go back even further than the Manunggul Jar, to the original migrations that populated the Philippine archipelago with the ancestors of today's Filipino people. The Austronesian-speaking peoples whose descendants became the Filipinos, were among the most extraordinary navigators in the history of the human species. Beginning somewhere around 5,000 years before the Common Era, and possibly earlier, waves of Austronesian-speaking migrants moved out of what is now Taiwan and southern China, spreading across the Philippine archipelago, and then, over centuries of continued movement, across the entirety of island Southeast Asia, into the Pacific, reaching the Hawaiian Islands, New Zealand, and Easter Island. They reached Madagascar off the coast of Africa, and in what remains perhaps the single most astonishing feat of pre-modern human navigation, Austronesian voyagers made contact with the indigenous peoples of South America, crossing the open Pacific Ocean, the largest body of water on Earth, in outrigger vessels without instruments, navigating by the stars, by ocean currents, by the behavior of birds and the patterns of waves, and they brought back with them the sweet potato, a crop native to South America, which then spread back westward through the Pacific and into Southeast Asia and East Asia. The ancestors of the Filipino people crossed the Pacific Ocean in canoes. That is the civilizational tradition from which pre-colonial Philippine culture descended. By the time we reach the historical period, the era in which written records begin to document what was happening in the Philippine archipelago, the societies that had developed from those ancient maritime migrations were sophisticated, regionally varied, and deeply integrated into the broader networks of Asian trade and civilization. The documentary record of pre-colonial Philippine history begins with a single object found in 1989 by a laborer dredging sand near the shores of Laguna Bay, the large lake southeast of Manila. He found a thin, discolored sheet of what he initially thought was old metal and sold it to an antique dealer. Eventually, it reached scholars who recognized it for what it was, the oldest written document ever found in the Philippines, and one of the most historically significant artifacts ever recovered from the archipelago.
If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe, like and share this video, and leave a comment below. Thank you for watching.